Hi there, this is Truth Seeker here, and I was gonna go outside and make this video, and I sat probably 10 minutes outside with this sweater and hat, and I am frozen to death. It is cold out there. This is April 29th. How can it be so cold? Oh, I understand it's supposed to be in the 80s next week, but anyway, yesterday I made a very long video, and I'm not going to do that today. I will spare you that. But I been going through my friend's book, How to Escape from Jehovah's Witnesses by Lloyd Evans. And I haven't read, the whole thing, but I've been going through it, and I did thumb forward to a section that I'm particularly interested in, and what he had to say about seeking professional help. Now, I began. I've gotten to about page 25 or 30. Yeah, I got up to chapter 2, so I haven't really gone too far. And I did kind of skim through some, and what I've seen so far is excellent. As always, Lloyd does excellent work. He's quite eloquent, and he is a sharp guy. He really gets right to the point, and he really targets his audience very well, which are Jehovah's Witnesses and those that are breaking away from the Watchtower Society. It's interesting. I've gotten into activism mainly because of the close relationship between the Bible students and Jehovah's Witnesses, and the fact that even though it doesn't seem that close to some, I wouldn't imagine too many Jehovah's Witnesses would agree with me. But they don't know, a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses don't know that Bible students still exist, and so the comparison is a little hard for them to make. But listening to the stories that I have for so many years about Jehovah's Witnesses, what they've experienced, how the culture of the Jehovah's Witnesses and so on, they bring me back to my days growing up as a Bible student. There's so many similarities, and it should be that way, because the Jehovah's Witnesses really derived from the Bible students, and so culturally, terminology-wise, doctrinally, the Bible students and the Jehovah's Witnesses are very, very close. They're closely akin to one another. And I remember growing up, the great sense of oppression that I felt growing up as a Bible student was overwhelming. I mean, I know Telltale Atheist, he talks about the one of the hallmarks of a cult is the numerous meetings. I know Paul Grundy has talked about that. The great number of meetings that Watchtower expects Jehovah's Witnesses to participate in, and especially the service work. Bible students don't put the pressure as much on the service work, but they do on the attendance aspect of the meetings. And boy, did we have meetings. When I was growing up, the meetings were day long meetings, all day long Sunday. So Sundays were gone. I mean, it wasn't just 2 meetings in the morning and you had the afternoon. First off, we had to drive all the way into New York City, which was 45 minutes away. And the meetings began about 9 o'clock in the morning, and they lasted till about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And so they were all day long. And then there were conventions, and then there were the children's gatherings once a month. There was a Saturday was devoted to gathering all of us regional, us kids in the New York region, from Connecticut all the way down to Washington, D.C., together and spend an entire Saturday being indoctrinated by elders who took specific interest in and focusing in on us kids to make sure that we would grow up in the faith, have a strong foundation in the faith, and carry the Bible student torch on in our lives, and until the end came. The end was always short. I mean, I grew up being taught that I probably wouldn't grow up into full adulthood because the kingdom was so close, and Armageddon was going to end this world soon. And we heard all the same stories that Jehovah's Witnesses heard. And I mean, I was afraid that I wasn't going to grow up. I remember at the age 14, I was asking my father questions because I wanted to have a life like normal people and grow up and get married. And Bible students many of them especially had strange ideas about the kingdom, that there wouldn't be marriage in the kingdom, and we would be like the angels, and that in fact many Bible students took Russell's point of view and thought that that Bible students people would be sexless, the way it originally was before Eve was taken from Adam. And Russell taught that at that point there was a division in the sexes, and that's why the institution of marriage came into place, because women and men together formed a perfect union, and that when the 1,000 years kingdom is established, that situation would return and people would be sexless again, and there would be no marriage and stuff like that. So that used to be actually quite distressing to me. But the pressure that was put on us, and the idea that we were so different, we were forced to remain separate from the world. I remember how difficult it was going to school and the kids on the block, because we were never around. We were always at a meeting. I mean, there were not only the Sunday meetings, but there were 3 or 4 midweek meetings that we would have to attend, especially in the New York area. There was what they would call a midweek meeting almost every night of the week. the only nights I think that there weren't any meetings. I think the only night that there wasn't a meeting was Saturday. Every other night of the week, except for Sunday, Saturday and Sunday. And Sunday was an all-day meeting. So we were constantly going to meetings, and that really took its toll on schoolwork. And there was no emphasis given to school because the kingdom was going to solve all things, and the kingdom was going to be established soon. So there wasn't any need for us kids to go to school. So I wasn't a good performer in school. I didn't do well in school because we were gone all the time. I remember a few years ago getting transcripts, school transcripts from my old high school, and I missed 20 days of school in my freshman year. In fact, every year, 20 to 25 days of school a year because of Bible student functions. My parents would pull us out of school, and you can't make that up. I mean, you're never going to be able to do well in school. We didn't have time to do our homework because we were always on the road. We were always going to different Bible student meetings up and down the East Coast. And so it was just this constant pressure of being, absorbed into this Bible student life. There just wasn't any room for anything else in our lives. So that caused us to have quite a bit of trouble emotionally and mentally, psychologically. Psychological development is critical in your first years of life, and high control groups such as the Bible students and the Jehovah's Witnesses, they really indoctrinate. They spend a tremendous effort indoctrinating you into what is advantageous to their objectives and to their goals, and these are not healthy objectives. It's an abnormal lifestyle. Being told things about God and how He looks upon you, and it just doesn't induce a healthy sense of who you are, and there's a strong degree of shame that is used to cause you to see the need to join, to accept the what they're telling you about yourself, that you're a sinful being, that you're imperfect, that you're in need of God's salvation, of God's help, because you are an unjust person infused throughout with sin because of original sin, because of Satan's influence in the garden. And so you're told constantly that you're born sinful, and that you need God's grace, and the way to be acceptable to God is to adopt the belief system and the culture that the Bible students impose upon you. Otherwise, you're not. You're just aligning with Satan. This world is ruled by Satan. In fact, they go to great lengths to separate us from the world, that all people are inherently wicked and sinful, and we can't trust people of the world because they're ulterior motives. They're being motivated by Satan, and we must stick close to the truth. And with the heavy sense of indoctrination that is imposed upon children, especially in the critical developmental period, you're not going to grow up with a healthy sense of who you are, and that causes that can cause severe emotional, psychological problems developmentally. It's a very terrible thing, really, to do to children, to just the lifestyle itself, and not only to add on the burden of the sexual abuse that many have to go through because of the policies and so on, especially in the Jehovah's Witnesses. In my case, I believe at least one brother was sexually abused by my mother, and that caused emotional problems that plagued me for quite some time. And my mother was protected by her association with the Bible students. I mean, how do you you can't just turn your mother in for these types of things. I mean, I didn't know how to talk about it, much less. I mean, I couldn't even talk about it to my counselor until maybe 10 years ago or so. It was pretty recent before we really got into the nitty gritty with that. It very embarrassing. It's something that is very difficult to talk about, especially when it's so close. And the fact that usually sexual abuse is a male and female. That's what most people think. But little boys are vulnerable, and my mother was a very ill person. She was a psychologically damaged person, and so it did happen. She it was very difficult, and I hated her. I hated her. I hated her very deeply. And I would feel guilty about how I hated her, especially when I got to being an adult, when I was in my 20s and 30s. I was taught as a Bible student to respect and love my parents, and my mother had done these things, and I couldn't get that feeling out, that feeling of repulsion, that I didn't want to be near her, that I just had very, 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 very bad feelings toward her. and yet she was the dear sister in the Bible students. And so how could I come out and talk about this? It was impossible. But because of these things, my brother committed suicide. I mean, the three of us had our own troubles. Luckily, I got help, and my younger brother, he seemed to he escaped it all by leaving, by getting away as far away as he could from the family. He went to California and went to college there, and he stayed away as much as he could, and he eventually phased out or faded from the Bible students. He no longer has any affiliation with any of the Bible students whatsoever. But my middle brother, he suffered tremendously, and he suffered from many different problems. He was suicidal for a long time. He was diagnosed as schizophrenic. He had a very low GAF score, which is a test, a measurement of being able to function in society. 100 is you can function perfectly well and you're perfectly well adjusted in society, and 0 is that you're not so you're not adjusted at all. And he was down in the single digits with his GAF score. I saw his GAF score, actually. He kept all his psychological records. Eventually, for 15 years, he tried to commit suicide. And I remember reading through some of these records that he kept in boxes. He finally got a Section 8 disability because of a psychological condition. He couldn't even work for 9 years he worked with the county road department, and he couldn't even continue working filling potholes. That was too much stress on him, and eventually he got a Section 8 apartment efficiency, and he had regular counseling, and he would have about 2 to 3 suicide attempts a year for probably about 15 years. This went on before he finally committed suicide at the age of 44. He was successful. He had saved up all his medications and took them all at once as antipsychotics. Very dangerous drugs. But in my case, I went through a period of substance abuse, mostly really alcohol. I tried marijuana, but I never really had an issue with drugs. I was afraid of drugs, scared of them, and I experimented a couple times with pot, but I didn't like it. And this was back in the 70s. But my brothers, especially my middle brother, he had a problem with heavy-duty drugs, heroin and LSD. And interestingly enough, there was an ashram that they got the LSD from. And the founder of that ashram, the ashram was only a couple of miles from our home. And my brothers freely got LSD at this place, and The guy who founded this was an associate of Timothy Leary's. They were both friends, and Timothy Leary would stay at this ashram. They were close friends. This Dr. Mishra now is long dead, but he was viewed as a spiritual leader, and he believed in mind-expanding drugs. He was a neurologist, I believe, at one point. But yeah, we had some crazy things happen. There were some experiences along the way that would be hard for people to believe, but they actually happened. And I'm not going to elucidate all of them because I could just go on for a long, long time. But in my situation, I didn't go to college because, one thing, I didn't graduate very well in school. I didn't do well in school, and I was taught that the world was going to end soon anyway, and I believed this. Even though I rejected the Bible students, I still believed. I was so heavily indoctrinated; it was just pumped into me. And I would think about Armageddon and what I would do to try and preserve myself, because I didn't think that that I was going to be part of the 144,000. I like most Bible students, I hadn't consecrated, and I just was hoping that I would get a chance in the 1,000 years. Although I didn't think I was going to get much of a chance, because I didn't think very highly of myself. I was the black sheep of the Bible students. But eventually situations got so crazy in my life, getting drunk and having at a bachelor party and having my boss threaten to shoot me with his gun was the trigger point for me. I didn't mean that as a pun, but that was the event, and that caused me to realize that I needed help. And when I thought of help, the only help I knew of was to return back with my tail between my legs as a prodigal son, the wicked prodigal son, back to the fold of the Bible students. And so I in that particular instance, it was a bachelor party for one of the guys in the shop that I worked with, and it was a pretty rough group of guys that you work with in auto mechanics, especially in those days. Some of them belonged to motorcycle gangs. And so I actually hung out with some pretty rugged characters in some situations. And the director of the shop, Sears Auto Center, was also invited, and he and I got into an argument, both drunk, and he started punching me on my chest, and then he threatened to shoot me with a gun. And that's when both of us were grabbed by other fellows in the area, and one of the guys told me, hey, you better leave. And I don't remember getting in my car. I guess I went to Denny's, where my girlfriend was working the night shift, and I woke up. They must have, one of the waitresses must have been going off shift, and they took me to her apartment. And I woke up in this apartment. I had no idea where I was. And it was Sunday morning. I had a terrible hangover, and I just got this huge wave of guilt over over me, and I just thought, they're right about me. I really am bad, and so that's how I got back into the Bible students after several years of not going to meetings. I did go to a few, but it wasn't a lot. I went several times a year, and that was about it. But then I decided that I was going to get involved. I was going back. I was going to become the best Bible student there ever was, and my girlfriend, well, we were tentatively engaged, I guess, for several years at that point, and she told me that I had brought her to a couple of those meetings, and she said that if I was going back to the Bible students, if we were ever going to get married, she would not allow me to go back to the Bible students. And so I said, okay, so long, and that was it. And I was going to straighten my life out. I got a job lined up down in Florida. I was going to move into Orlando, where my cousins lived. My cousins had never gotten into a speck of trouble in their lives, and I thought they would be good examples for me, and that was be a wholesome, healthy environment for me. And so I was ready to move down there, and I went to the General Convention, and that was in July. The convention was in July, and I was going to move down to Florida in August. Everything was arranged, and in July I met my wife at the General Convention, and I just went head over heels for her. I never knew her. She was a fringe Bible student, and I knew everybody. I grew up in the center of the Bible students movement, so I knew everyone, and she was new to me because her father was a Bible student, but my wife's mother was not a Bible student, and so my wife did not grow up going to meetings or to conventions, and so I never knew her, and she was kind of like me. She was going through some emotional crisis, and her father encouraged her to attend the Bible students meetings, said that would help her. And that's how I ended up meeting her. But we were both in the same boat. And my God, was she a knockout. Holy cow, there was nothing like her in the Bible students, I could tell you that. She had been an athletic tower diver. She was nationally ranked, and she could have gone to the Olympics if she wanted to, if she really had put a focus on it, but apparently some bad luck fell her way, and she didn't do well in the nationals. She had 104 fever when she was in the nationals, and I guess that kind of took her chances away as a tower diver. But boy, was she, well, let's put it this way. When she was diving at University of Miami, she had won Best Diver Body Award. So she was a real stunning beauty when I met her, and I just fell instantly for her. And by the end of the week, the General Convention, all I did was hang out with her as much as I could, and we both were interested in one another, and by the end of the week, we spent the last night of the convention talking the whole night through, and I was shy actually, and I was afraid to kiss her, and so I walked her back to her dorm. It was about 4 a.m. We had been talking all night long in a lounge, one of the dormitory lounges. This was held at a Albion college. All the conventions were held in colleges, and so I was walking her back to her dorm room, and at the door I asked her, may I give you a kiss goodnight? And she said, sure. And that was it. I was done for. The next morning, it was that same morning, everybody was packing up to leave the general convention. And I got up at 6, and I was looking all over for her, and I finally found her. She was with her dad and her brother in the parking lot, but the trunk opened, and they were just putting their suitcases in the trunk to leave. They were going to go down to Illinois and visit her grandfather, and I found her, and I gave her a big kiss in front of her father. Apparently, that was something that never happened. He never liked any of her boyfriends, and some of them were, well, they were all. Her brother was a doctor, so her brother was bringing home his college friends, doctors, and some were lawyers that she was dating all along. And I was just this auto mechanic with hair shoulder length, and and I didn't. It didn't. To me, I wasn't intimidated by that point because I had gotten the courage to say goodnight to her and kiss her goodnight the night before. And after we kissed, I told her right in front of her dad, I'm not going to lose you. And well, anyway, this is our 40th year. We've been married. We got engaged three weeks after we were married. We got engaged 3 weeks after we met, and we got married 5 months after we met. Exactly 5 months after we met in December, on December 30th. And this is our 40th year this year, and but it's not that without our knocks. You see, I had issues that arose, psychological, mental issues I didn't really understand. As a result of having been raised in the Bible students, and my sense of self, and I needed help, and I didn't understand it. And I think a lot of people are in that situation. They don't understand that how much damage a cult can do to an individual, especially their sense of self, who they are, and we got married, and things were perfect for a long time. But after I had finished college and I started on a professional career, and we got on our own, things began, in earnest for us, and I didn't know how to deal. I had very few coping skills. I had none, essentially, except alcohol, and I began drinking again, and drinking heavier and heavier, and I didn't know what was going on. I couldn't understand. Throughout my life, I had had a problem with rage. As a child, I had a problem with rage as far back as 10 years old that I can remember, and the rage was as a result of the abuse that I didn't understand that, and the worse that my rage got, the more I was using alcohol to cope with the situation. And no matter how much I believed in the doctrines of the Bible students, no matter how much I thought of it as being the truth, it didn't stop. It by itself was not sufficient in helping me with the rage that I was succumbed to. Whenever we had pressures, and pressures always arise in marriage, then I would burst into these rages that I couldn't control. They just happened, and I didn't understand it. And it got to the point where I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror. I was so ashamed of myself, and I would make vows to God that I would never do that again, never ever behave that way again. And I could not control it. It would not stop. And I didn't know what to do. Eventually, one night I came home. The house was empty. She had taken the girls to her brother's house up in Connecticut. And she had worked this thing out with her father and with her brother, who had just gone through a divorce, and he moved into his he was having an affair with a coworker, and she and her husband separated, and she had the house, and my brother-in-law left his wife, and she kept her house, and he moved into his new girlfriend's home. Eventually, he and she got married, but at the time my wife moved up there with the girls, they had this big house. He was an important doctor, world-renowned researcher, and he had a lot of money, and he had a huge home that he put my wife and my kids up in, and she became the nanny to the combined families up there. So our kids, my brother-in-law's daughter, and his girlfriend's 2 boys, and so there was this big, huge, blended sort of family, but they hadn't married yet, and it was just this big, crazy thing. And I was home alone in this house, empty. My brother-in-law had come down one weekend and emptied the house of all the furniture and everything else, so I had nothing except the cat. And I thought that was it. And nothing seemed to help me, And my neighbor across the street worked at a local college. It was a state college, and he ended up being a dean there, and he was also a lawyer. And so I thought I'd go over and ask him. I thought my marriage was done, and I thought, I'm going to need a lawyer. We're going to get divorced, and I'm going to need a lawyer. And he said, no, you don't need a lawyer. He says, what you need is a counselor. And it was the last thing on my mind. I didn't know I needed counseling. Nobody in the Bible students ever talked about psychological counseling. I knew nothing about it. I knew nothing about that there was this field of help, this area of help. I knew nothing about it. I was very ignorant about these things, and so I thought I'd give it a try, and I did. I was at a low point. I mean, I wasn't going to, at any other point, there was no way I would ever have accepted worldly help. But I was below I was so low at that point that I was willing to accept any advice, any help. And so rather than get a lawyer, I ended up getting a counselor. And 4 months later, my wife came back and with the girls, and we reconciled, and we never did get that divorce. And I went to counseling for 3 years, and then she began to come, and we started having couples counseling for about a year. And then we thought everything was okay. But actually, I never really worked on the issues. And I was still associated with the Bible students. I still believed in all of the doctrines, the same values, the everything that I had been taught. I still believed in very deeply. And after I stopped going to counseling, having the counselor, and I was going about twice a week, and she would come with me on frequently, often in that last year, I would think about once a week. So, but I was getting counseling twice a week, once myself and once with her. And after we thought everything was fine and we were happy, really what it was we had this guy that was watching us, it was like a watchdog, and it didn't really, I wasn't working on the issues, on the real issues that I needed to work on. And so after I left counseling, I gradually began reverting back into my old behavior. And I didn't realize, at first what it was, and then my drinking began to increase again, and then the rage, and I hated myself. I couldn't look at myself in the mirror, and I knew then, by that point, my brother had committed suicide, and I started thinking that might be the only way out, and I was really causing a lot of trouble at home. And then one night, I got into one of my rages, and I had been drinking, and my wife started begging me not to leave. I was walking out the door. She begged me not to leave, and I went out and I got a DUI, and that turned things around. I had to get help. I had to get help. At that point, I realized that there was no alternative. I needed something, because whatever was going on, I needed to start with a clean slate, because no matter what I believed and no matter how much I believed it, it was not keeping me from staying out of trouble. And so initially, I started in AA because I ended up with this state-mandated course called IDRC, and they pushed AA. And this was a state governmental program that pushed it, and I started on that. But eventually, I ended up with a counselor, a specialist, and he really worked me. He really worked me, and I worked in cognitive therapy, and we talked about what cognitive therapy was about, and I did a lot of research, and I really worked at it. I really worked hard, and I stayed with it for a long time, and I'm still in counseling. I didn't believe I needed counseling. Initially, I never would have ever thought that I would have needed counseling, and I realized that it was due to damage that was caused by my upbringing. Eventually, I was able to really take a good close look at how I was raised, the abuse that happened to me as a child, and its impact and its effect on me. That's where a lot of the rage originated, and I didn't understand that. And as a result of working, and I mean really putting myself to it, counseling isn't just this magic thing. Counseling takes effort. Counseling means work, and it's not a simple thing that just happens. You don't just talk through things and all of a sudden you make breakthroughs. It's behavioral change. It's cognitive. When situations arise, it's giving you alternatives, so that when let's say situations where I would end up raging, they'd give me alternative behaviors that I got to think about this. I got to stop myself. I got to stop at this point. You see, it gave me tools to learn how to cope with situations that I didn't have before, and that I didn't know about, and so that I could never cure myself of the rage that was within me, and I haven't had a. It's really been quite something because I started in therapy in 2002. Here it is, 2018, and I think the last time that I had anything of any behavioral issues, it's been about 15, 16 years since I had any outbursts of any sort, and I'm not a perfect human being by any means, but I really did put myself to it. I never thought that I would be the kind of person that would need help. I didn't know about it for one thing, and I didn't know what it was. But it's a pretty important thing because I think a lot of people, most people who need therapy, don't really realize that they need it. And I think that's true about the majority of people, especially if they have psychological problems such as personality disorders. That I've done a bit of research on this, on these things such as personality disorders, and it's the fracturing of the sense of self. In the developmental years, in the early years, they can trace these things back to the earliest years of your development, and they manifest themselves in early adulthood. And so, for the damage is done early on in a person's life. And so you don't even remember the circumstances that caused the emotional and mental problems that become problematic for you later on in life. And many individuals with mental disorders and personality disorders, in particular, narcissists, these are just coping mechanisms to deal with things that they don't know how to deal with. They're rigid because they don't have a flexible way of dealing with different things and circumstances that arise in the world. I mean, life hits you in different ways, and a person with a personality disorder doesn't know how to deal with differing circumstances, so they deal with it in the same way all the time. So when something different arises in their life, they respond exactly the same to all situations, and so they're rigid in their coping mechanisms, in their way of dealing with life, and so there's they don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with them. Narcissists have found a way to think that they're perfect and that there's no need for them to, everybody else is imperfect and they're the epitome of perfection. So they don't. Narcissists are very difficult to deal with because they're the last people who will come to think that they need help. The same with sociopaths and psychopaths, because there's an element of narcissism associated with psychopathy and sociopathy, and those are characteristic elements of those disorders. And usually people with those types of disorders are not the ones that will be inclined to get help. But the damage that causes these disorders occurs very early in one's life, and I can see, that being raised in a cult, and an inflexible cult that tells you that the world is black and white and this is the only way to look at the world, is not going to be the healthiest environment in which to raise a child, especially when they tell you that you're sinful, that you're a bad person, that you're born in sin, and that you're and they use shame as a motivating mechanism. That's going to cause a great deal of damage in a child's sense of who they are as they're growing up, especially at the very young ages. So anyway, these are the things that I understand. I'm not going to give a much. Yesterday I went 2 hours and 30 minutes with my video, so here it is, an hour, and I think I made my point using my own experience and experience with my family, my brothers, my background, my religious background. So anyway, I do think that many more people who are raised in circumstances like I was raised in, circumstances, environments that are created by high control groups like Jehovah's Witnesses and let's say the Mormons or Scientology, and where they use shame as a motivator. I think that's going to create real psychological damage and emotional trauma that is going to impact people later on in their lives. And again, often most people deal with these things, these personality disorders, in a way are compensation for this environmental deficiency and being treated in a non-loving way as a child, you're not necessarily going to think that you're the issue, that you need help, that it's the rest of the world, and that's how you cope with it. The rest of the world is bad, and they need help. You don't need help. So anyway, I think I've made my point, and I really think and hope the best for people who come out of these types of things. And I would encourage that even if you don't have emotional trauma, if you're not depressed, if you're you don't think that the trouble in your life is really as a result of anything that has impacted you, I would recommend getting counseling because of the extreme degree to which these religions create an abnormal environment for growing up in, and giving people a proper and healthy sense of self as they grow up. And I think, one of the things that is mentioned over and over again about Jehovah's Witnesses, and this is true about Bible students, is the high rate of suicide. Well, people with emotional and mental disorders have a higher degree of suicide. You look at the DSM, and you notice that when you read about these different personality disorders, the rates of suicide that are associated with these personality disorders is significantly higher than the suicide rate of society in general. So that's evidence in and of itself that these cults are creating a situation where people are growing up with a fractured sense of self, and more susceptible to mental disease, and more susceptible to suicide. So, I mean, I admit to having gone through all of that myself, and even suicidal ideations, both as a teenager and both later on in life, after my brother committed suicide. I honestly thought that he might have had the right solution to things, and it crossed my mind a number of times. I didn't formulate plans, but the idea, what they call suicidal ideation, did cross my mind. But anyway, I don't know. I hope this video has been of some help to people. I know that seeking professional help is not what most people want to hear, but I think for people in our situation, it's probably the appropriate thing to do, because whether you realize it or not, these high control groups, these high pressure, oppressive, terribly oppressive religious organizations create a psychological damage, especially in the very early formative years. So anyway, this is Truth Seeker, wishing you the best, and hope that all things, that you have a happy week this coming week.
We fell in love almost 40 years ago.
40 years.
And it's never been better.
My fuzzy head.